Well, it's official. I promised myself I wouldn't do this. From day one, I said I wouldn't do this. But now we have an issue that it directly affects me. It directly affects every Canadian out there. And I just can't not be a little bit political. And I'm talking about the nitrogen regulations or emissions reductions target that's just been announced by Trudeau. So I've taken some time to consider what's going on and what I want to say and how I want to say it, because I don't want to be too wordy and I don't want to come across as fear-mongering or as lopsided or any of that kind of stuff. So forgive me if it's a bit jumpy, but this is an extremely important topic that we need to talk about. And it needs to be done with some nuance. I can't just go to the top of that bin and start screaming. A, nobody's going to hear. B, it's going to be incoherent. And C, I'm probably going to get emotional and it's going to sound like gibberish. So what has me all wound up? Well, this week, the federal government has announced, after consulting with regional and provincial agriculture representatives and ministers, as in it went and talked to them and didn't listen at all. Just, I'm going to talk to you to say I talked to you, but then I'm going to do my own thing regardless. They've announced that they want a 30% reduction in nitrogen emissions in the next few years here. And if you follow history, what's happened recently, much like the carbon tax, well, it started as an emissions target, and then it turned into a credit system that never worked, and then it turns into a tax. And all of these extra costs come down to the end users, and in this case, the end and beginning users, to make life more expensive. Sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? It's happening again. It happened with carbon dioxide. Now it's happening with nitrogen. First things first, don't get me wrong. I do not think nitrogen emissions are a good thing. In fact, farmers for decades have been trying to figure out a better way to utilize every ounce of product that they put down, whether this be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, manganese, boron, all these other little things that make for a healthy plant. Because a healthy plant produces more food, which means cheaper food for you at the store. Pretty simple solution, isn't it? So the government just outright chooses to ignore all the positive progress that farmers and the agriculture industry in general have made in the last few decades. If you were to trend that, the amount of nitrogen emissions per bushel of grain produced would be on a hard downslope. And it is probably getting tougher right now to reduce those emissions than it ever has. But the government doesn't care about what we've already done. They just say that's not enough. So let's explain what we have done. There's variable rate technology so that we are not putting excess fertilizer in places that will not grow a great crop, and places that will grow a great crop will get extra fertilizer. There has been upgrades in precision farming that allow for accurate fertilizer placement, where it's going to be close enough to the seed early on that it hits it right away and it starts using it. Those roots just tap into it, starts growing plant. And not too close that it hurts the plant. There's been technologies and applications that delay or control the nitrification process, such as urease inhibitors or ESN, which is a polymer-coated pearl of urea, to delay how fast it can be released so that it doesn't get vented off to the atmosphere and wasted. Others are continuous cropping and cover cropping so that your nutrients aren't going to waste. Rotational crops so that you have a balance and you capture nitrogen with some plants and you utilize it with others. But apparently that's not enough. So what's going to happen? Likely nothing in the first year. I would guess that they'll find some time to make some regulations, and they'll say that they're going to do something that will reward the people that don't use it or reduce it. It's not going to do anything. So then they will start permitting. And this could be, you have to register, and then you're only allowed to buy X number of pounds of N based on some sort of silly ratio, and possibly pay a tax on excess. Then they're going to move the goalposts again. That's not going to be enough. So then every pound of N is going to have tax on it. Now, it seems like it's only going to affect the farmer. But what's really going to happen is the amount of food produced, and food being crops such as wheat, barley, canola, peas, soybeans, lentils, corn, what else? Durum, chickpeas, faba beans, camelina, the list goes on and on and on. And that's just the field crops out here. I'm not talking about field vegetables such as your lettuce, your carrots, your turnips, sweet corn, and your fruits. Let's talk about fruits, and so on and so on. All of that is going to go up in price. Two different reasons. One is there's going to be less of it, so supply and demand will drive the price up. The other reason is that Canada will have to start importing to cover the shortcomings of this silly legislation. So rather than supporting its own economy and generating tax dollars off of tax dollars inside, they're going to have to start sending money overseas and paying other farmers to feed Canada. Doesn't that sound silly? It's a lot like the energy crisis right now, that Canada could be self-sufficient in their own oil industry, but we're importing. We are creating jobs in other parts of the world and eliminating Canadian jobs that would create tax on tax on tax on tax. You'd say, no, that's not how it works. Yes, it is. A company produces something. They pay tax. They also have employees. All those employees pay income tax. All those employees go out and buy food, and they pay tax on that. And they buy cars, and they pay tax on that. And they buy fuel, and they pay a lot of tax on that. We could have a balanced budget tomorrow if we had our own oil industry, self-sufficient oil industry. If we shipped Western Canadian oil and Newfoundland oil to refineries instead of hauling in from Venezuela, from no longer Russia, but from Saudi Arabia. I've worked in Saudi Arabia. It is not clean oil there, and it is not ethical oil either. So we literally, instead of buying our own stuff, refining it, and selling it at a profit, we ship it out to be refined. We buy the refined stuff back at a higher cost, and then we sell it to our own people at an even higher cost. That's what's going to happen in the food industry. We are going to have to import food, whether in grains and whatnot, or import the refined foods, which is where you take the raw grains or raw vegetables or whatever, and you start making products. Whether that be, for example, barley, you're making beer with it. Wheat, you're making bread. Durum, you're making pasta. Canola, you make oil to make other stuff. And the list goes on and on and on. And I haven't even touched on what's going to happen to the price of meat, because there's going to be less high quality grain available. That's going to drive the price of feed grain through the roof. Feed grain is used to either feed or finish animals, livestock, before they're processed into consumer meat. You know, wheat, barley, corn, soybeans, all this stuff. The low-grade stuff gets fed to animals. So if there's less of it, all of a sudden the cost of feeding an animal goes up, so the price required to purchase that animal to slaughter also goes up. If that's up, the consumer pays more. It sucks, but that's reality. So let's look at what's going on in Canada right now. At the moment, we have energy, I'm not going to call it a crisis, but instability. We have a housing bubble that's on the verge of popping, if it hasn't already. We have a vast majority of Canadians that are in debt to their eyeballs, that many are within a couple $100 of insolvency, which is not a good place to be. We have high inflation partially caused by supply chain and logistics issues caused by the pandemic. But then we have inflation caused by the government borrowing money and then printing money to devalue its own money. This overall inflation right now is clipping at nearly 10%. And on top of that, food inflation is outpacing overall inflation. So it costs you more for all those little goods, but then even more to feed your growing family. It's not a good place to be in right now. And the government thinks it's a great time to contribute to a food shortage. Farmers absolutely hate being wasteful. Every pound of fertilizer we put on, every pound of seed that we put on is calculated. It's a risk versus reward ratio. And we want to do our best to make good crops for you guys so that we can continue doing that. It doesn't make sense for us to be wasteful. The stakes are way too high. It is way too risky to be laissez-faire with fertilizer, which was at an all-time high last year. With diesel, again at an all-time high. With equipment prices, prices are through the roof right now because of the supply chain BS that's going on there. So you're probably going, oh, well, here goes another right-wing kook just spouting away at stuff he doesn't know about. You'd probably be surprised that I'm probably more left-wing than I am right. And I'm also a bit libertarian. I'm left-wing on certain issues. I'm right-wing on others. So I don't see why more people aren't like this. For example, I believe strongly in socialized healthcare, to the point that I think we haven't done enough. We should have dental, vision, and hearing all included. I don't think we should have seniors paying thousands of dollars for hearing aids. I don't think that we should have families having to shell out thousands and upwards of tens of thousands of dollars for children's braces or fillings. And the reason for this is, I think happy, healthy people will cost less in the grand scheme of things. They will have less health issues, they will live happier lives, they'll be more productive in society, and then they will cost less in the overall run. I am pro-choice. I am anti-religion, actually. I don't believe religion should have any factor on anything that happens in the public in general. But I also believe that you should have the absolute right to practice your own religion as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. I am a free speech absolutist, which probably puts me on the right. I am pro-gun, but I am pro-gun control. How's that sound? I think there's way too many levels of government, and I think there's way too many gatekeepers in the government. So it's hard to shoehorn me into the right. The best way I find to describe myself is a left-leaning centrist that believes in minimal government, but extreme government accountability and fiscal responsibility.